Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everybody to our 1 o'clock session on community-based archives. I am Mike Miller, and I will be your moderator for this session. And before we get started and I turn it over to the presenters, there's just a few housekeeping items to go over. We will be utilizing the chat feature in the Zoom for questions. So if you get questions as they come up, please submit them into the chat window. We will be saving the answers part to the Q&A to the very end, and I will be keeping track of questions posted. So feel free to post them whenever you have the question pop into your mind, and I will save it, and I will be sharing the questions with the presenters at the very end. If you have any issues with the connection or ever problems, feel free to chat with me directly in the chat window, and I will see if I can help you with any technical difficulties you're having. And so with that, I will turn it over to our first presenter who will be kicking us off, Dr. Jamie Lee. Jamie, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much, Mike, and thank you all for being here today. Our presentation is titled Community-Based Archives and the Power of Naming Practices. And it gets its name from the similarly called research project for which I received an IMLS Early Career Grant in July of 2019. And this research is fueled by my own hands-on experiences, starting a community archives, making it grow, and trying to make it sustainable, and at times against all odds. So this research centers language and naming, and it's at the heart of my work as a scholar, archivist, documentary filmmaker, and activist. And as a queer identified feminist, this work connects to the why and how questions that I ask of archives, records, media, and the often overlooked effects they have on people's everyday lives. So archives affect how we know and understand ourselves in history, in our own histories, and as historic actors. And I hope that after today's presentation, you'll have plenty to think about in your own archival context and in your home communities. And I encourage you to drop notes, ideas, experiences into the chat along with questions. Okay, so I'm grateful to work with such amazing graduate research assistants. In our first year, I worked with Kristen Swaggy and Samantha Montes. Kristen is from the Cherokee Nation and as a Knowledge River scholar pursued her MA in Library and Information Science at the University of Arizona. And she now works as library specialist at the Benito Garcia Library on the Thana O'odham Nation just south of Tucson. And Samantha, another Knowledge River scholar, graduated with her MA in LIS last year and is now working at Pima County Public Libraries. This year, I've worked with Ames Emsweiler and Bianca Finley. Ames is a community archivist from Southeast Texas, founder of the Inside Books Project archive, and has been an archival fellow for the Texas After Violence Project. They earned their MA in Gender and Women's Studies and MS in Information Studies at UT Austin in 2020. And they're currently a doctoral student at the U of A and is exploring the relationship between archives and grassroots social movements. Bianca is a Knowledge River scholar pursuing her MA in LIS, through which she is focused on archives and special collections and their representation and access for non-dominant communities, especially Latinx and Native American populations. She earned her BA in Art History and MA in Museum Studies at San Francisco State University and worked as a curator and exhibition producer in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums before returning to pursue her master's. And I'm Jamie Lee, just tenured associate professor now at the University of Arizona School of Information, where I work at the intersections of critical archival studies, community archives, multimodal storytelling, and bodies. And you can see more of my research at thestorytellinglab.io. And now leading into more about this particular project. So I want to start with the overarching research questions. It's a 3-year project, and seeing these questions will certainly give you the lenses through which I've come to the project and understand the importance of the project. So the first question, how are naming practices, those related to archival appraisal and description, understood, deployed, and importantly, differently consequential for distinct communities? And how can archival description practices be reimagined to account for the incommensurable ontologies and epistemologies within and among communities? And lastly, how can these reimagined practices be applicable across the spectrum of community-based archives to be relevant, to empower, and to respectfully establish new historical narratives from and about underrepresented communities? So what are community-based archives? With a project that centers CBA, I offer these ideas for defining community-based archives in and through relationships. First, this research focuses on engaging archives that are situated at different points and in distinct relationships to the institution, along what I call a community institution archival spectrum. So I think that if you work with something that you know or call a community archive, there is a distinct relationship to what you might know as institutional archival context. And for my work founding the Arizona Queer Archives, it is loosely connected to the University of Arizona and the Institute for LGBT Studies, as well as forming my key research area in my role as faculty at the U of A. So the Arizona Queer Archives is not a nonprofit, and we have no budget besides the shoestrings and what sorts of grassroots movements and fundraising efforts we can piece together with research funds and community donations. So the relationships to the institution are flexible and they change over time. And so here are just a few examples of what we've been talking about here in this particular research project. We have the autonomous archives that are their own nonprofits or community organizations. And then we have community-based projects that have emerged from institutional archival contexts. And often these can be political as they're situated sometimes in extractive sort of practices within communities. And so that's one thing to, really be checking into how the power circulates in that relationship. And then there are others too that fall into the spaces between the two and across the two. And so each of these also has distinct relationships to communities that they're intending to represent. So in this research, we look carefully at how each of these, community and institution, may influence description, keywords, metadata, and so on. Who is doing the naming? How are they doing the naming? And why? And then I ask you all, where do your archives sit in the spectrum? So I believe that community archives are integral to studying the power of the archives and the roles that communities play in representing themselves individually and collectively through bodies of knowledge. And here are the partner archives that we've been working with now for the past almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years at the end of June. The Arizona Queer Archives, the AQA, what I mentioned earlier as a messy sort of community archives with changing relationships to the institution. The Chicana Research Collection and their community-driven archives project at Arizona State University, which is a community project that emerged through the university library system through the hands of one particular amazing archivist, librarian, a Knowledge River alum, someone who's very attentive to community. And the third is the Houston Area Rainbow Collective History Project, or HoustonARCH, which is an umbrella sort of collective that originally brought together institutional, community, and personal archivists working with LGBTQ+ collections to seek funding for digitization projects through Rice University and the University of Houston. HoustonARCH still loosely exists, but the institutional archival contexts have continued to grow, and they've continued to bring in more community and personal archives into the University of Houston under this particular name of the HoustonARCH over time. So again, their relationships are ever changing, and also I think contingent on when certain community and personal archives may find their way to the institution. And then lastly, the South Asian American Digital Archive, SAADA, an autonomous nonprofit that is not connected to institutional archival contexts, except in ways that their director and board of directors agree upon. And so these are the 4 groups that we work with. And here's a bit about research in year one. So we researched the language used by the partner archives with regard to their mission, vision, collection policies, appraisal policies. We created an annotated bibliography with scholarly publications, community resources about community-based archives, description, naming, and representation. And in the creation of this particular annotated bibliography, we also centered our own naming of search terms to look at what sort of terms are coming up and how through time they're also changing. We've researched community-based archives from around the US, their mission vision statements, and looking through the uses of traditional standards or self-created descriptive practices, or even a mix of the two. We've worked with key contacts at each partner archives to schedule focus groups and individual interviews with diverse community stakeholders. And then we facilitated the focus groups and interviews via Zoom instead of face-to-face because of COVID from August 2020 through January 2021. So now this year, year two, we've done the focus groups and the interviews, and I'm continuing to co-author a chapter for an edited collection on critical pedagogy with the graduate research assistants from year one. And Ames and Bianca, who are here with me today, we have been working with the data. We've been transcribing, editing, coding, recoding, and really thinking through the power of naming in our own work as researchers and how we understand and make the data meaningful. So the focus groups and the individual interviews, each partner archives hosted a focus group that included 10 participants, and it lasted 2 hours. And then each partner archives helped to recruit 3 diverse stakeholders to participate in individual interviews, and each interview lasted 1 to 2 hours. And just change. I'm going to now hand the microphone over to Ames, and do I stop sharing right now, Ames?
Yeah, I'm gonna take over. I think I can boot you.
Okay,
Thank you,
please
Rachel,
do.
for letting us know about that. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? I can't see, I guess, so just say if you can't. So what I kind of brought to this was some experience using Deduce to do some qualitative analysis. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna set my timer. Qualitative analysis of interviews. And so basically that involves uploading transcripts of stuff that were originally transcribed by Otter AI. And so you upload them, and you go in and let's see. So we use kind of a blend of inductive and deductive coding. So we brought in kind of what we were looking for based on the parameters of the project. So we were thinking about, description and naming practices. And then also as we went along, kind of collaboratively worked to develop codes based on some other things we were seeing. For example, Bianca was kind of pointing out some good themes around space, place, and locality. We looked at positionality and identity. We separated it between community and institutional archivists, which is obviously, a big binary and reductive kind of way of thinking about it, but we weren't doing it so much in a kind of a prescriptive way, just kind of using Deduce as a flexible tool to help with analysis, but not so much just like a strict, way to analyze things. So it's a helpful, flexible tool. And so you can go in and analyze your codes in the qualitative charts. And so some useful ones are like the code co-occurrences. So you can kind of just see in interviews like what what snippets of data or people's quotes are, cross like double posted basically, and where the intersections like really showing up for people. And so you can see kind of, core archival functions and dominant institutions will be cross-coded a lot. Community needs and description and naming, so you see a lot there, and you can click in and look at the actual like excerpts for that. which is really helpful, and that you can also make memos and work with your team that way to kind of look at emerging themes from that information. So it's a useful tool. It's pretty affordable too if you're working on a research team. So it's a good tool to have. And then so I'm going to go back to Jamie, the presentation slides. Can you represent based on where we were at? And so some of the emerging themes we were looking at, so you can go to the next one. That's like a cloud code you can do too, which is fun. So one quote, I'm just going to read parts of them. So this person with HoustonARCH said, I'd like to see young people try to bridge that gap between history and today. The struggle, like these struggles didn't just happen. That was a fight. We wanted a voice, and it's a constant battle. And if people forget about those battles, well, look at how many times we've been pushed back into the closet. Look at our current regime. And so emerging themes, I've been thinking about urgency, loss, survival, militancy and battle, autonomy and resource distribution. So over the last few years in my work, this is stuff I've really honed in on and been thinking about, and had just kind of finished like a chapter on what I described as militant memory work. And there's a lot of quotes that kind of resonated with that, like this other one. We gripped our identity in a forceful way and sometimes militant way. And so really just showing how for a lot of these community archivists, there's a big sense of critical urgency in the face of loss of like elders and the face of violence. And so it's really a intense struggle for a lot of them. It's not so much about this idea of preserving for, you know, academic research per se, or an institution per se, or like a future audience, but more, you know, how are people being impacted by these things now? And what can we do to kind of recuperate those narratives and support people and practice world building in the here and now? And so, let's see, yeah, a lot of people too kind of, you can go to the next slide, Jamie. There's a lot too on kind of having like fantasies and dreams of resource redistribution and autonomy. So to read snippets from this one, they said, in my fantasy, I'd want the archives to be separate. And they're talking about separate from like a university institution. They said, you know, that we as a community could fund the archives, own the archives, be a part of the operating of the archives. Then it becomes our community. I respect what the institution has been able to do for our community. It's difficult to be in academia and be LGBT, whether you're a student, professor, but I like to see the archives become something that's ours, not restricted by the institution. I play with a fantasy, our own building, the library, the temperature control rooms that are easy to access, easy to get around in. All of us as a community support what we're doing and contribute and want to contribute to the holding of our history. And so that I just think embodied a lot of what I've been seeing again around discussing like resources and mutual beneficial relationships. And often I also like this quote because she acknowledges that people, you know, queer folks are moving among these spaces, like in academia and in the community. It's not, again, the strict binary. But what she's identifying more so is this uneven distribution of resources across these spaces, which I think is a really good way to kind of challenge the simplistic binary, but also acknowledge that there is that uneven distribution. And so how can communities or the people that are, you know, directly participating in history is represented, be more empowered or have more agency and autonomy and resources to sustain that work without this reliance on an institution. And from that, you can build mutually beneficial relationships, but it's not this kind of like dependency relationship. You can go to the next slide. Okay, yeah, that's just what I was talking about. And again, you know, we can see the co-occurrences. There's like sustainability and dominant institutions. And so that's where you could kind of look and see like, well, what are they saying about those things? And a lot of people like Lavina were talking about these sustainability concerns. On the left, the codes for that were funding, labor, policies and practices, public interest in history, space and storage. And so for almost all the ones I've looked at and coded so far, there was that tension between, we really, you know, appreciate the individuals in these spaces who are helping with redistribution, but when it becomes this dependency, or you know, this one person maybe is facilitating this because they are moving among the spaces, then it becomes more precarious because that could change. And yeah, that's what I had.
Thank you, Ames. So you can go to the next slide. I participated in both the group focus group interviews and individual interviews with SADA and the Chicano Research Collection and Community Archives project. But I'll start with SADA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with SADA, but just a quick overview. It was founded in 2008 by Samit Malik and Michelle Caswell. It's nonprofit. And SADA's mission is to create a more inclusive society by giving voice to South Asian Americans through documenting, preserving, and sharing stories that represent their unique and diverse experiences. Next. SADA disrupts the traditional archival model in that it's completely autonomous. It's community created, community governed, and community operated. It's participatory, and it's post-custodial. It hosts and preserves digital surrogates, and it also describes and links to relevant digital objects held in other repositories. Next. With SADA, description of the collection is iterative, and it allows for redescription. Because it's participatory, it allows for responsive community naming and use of preferred terms, but it also allows for recontextualizing and refining of the collection, which means it makes space for new meanings and themes to emerge. SADA also makes an effort to represent the diversity of South Asian American culture and to avoid reductive naming and essentializing. And it also addresses marginalization within the South Asian American community. And here I've included an image of, oh, sorry, can we stay? That's okay. Just a quick image of the Timeline project that talks a little bit about a moment in history that I don't think is discussed as often. That is Punjabi Mexican families who were immigrants in Northern California that found commonality and married and had a life together. Next. So speaking to the iterative and redescription process, Samit in the focus group interview talked about the themes that they have in SADA were created many years ago and don't necessarily reflect the collections anymore because there's so many more materials than there were. Next. And Michelle followed up just talking about the flexibility of the process, saying that, you know, if SADA wants to change a term, they don't have to petition the Library of Congress, they just do it. They have a conversation, they'll ask for feedback, but it's really, the important part is it's not a process of asking permission from some authority that is external to the community. Next. And then just talking about telling diversity of stories in SADA and the potential for marginalization even within communities. Anna Coates, who is a stakeholder community member of SADA, discussed her own history and talking to her family about including Guyanese American stories in the SADA collection. And her family sort of replied, well, they don't really want us, they tell you that, but they don't. And Anna talked about, you know, how including these Guyanese American stories will help do the work of breaking down those barriers. Next. So turning to Arizona State University and the Chicano Research Collection and the community-driven archives initiative that came out of Nancy Godoy's work there. The Chicano Research Collection was founded in 1970, And it came at the request of the library director, but it was in response to growing demands of ASU students and faculty who were activists in the Chicano movement. It was modeled after similar efforts at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Santa Barbara. And it was really a library collection and development plan that centered the educational and research needs of Mexican American and Chicano students. It evolved later into an archive where, under the stewardship of Dr. Christine Marin, they actively pursued and created collections that documented the history of Latinx in the Southwest. And it's now part of the Hayden Library at ASU's Distinctive Collections Unit. Next. Nancy Godoy became the associate archivist at the Chicano Research Collection about 9 years ago. And in 2017, she secured the 3-year Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funding for the Community-Driven Archives Initiative. And this CDA initiative focuses on building relationships with marginalized communities in the greater Phoenix metropolitan area that have largely been overlooked in the Hayden Library's archival collections. And Nancy emphasized in the interviews that, this kind of work doesn't happen overnight. It takes multiple people, multiple archivists working over many years to develop these relationships with the community. It's also cross-departmental and collaborates with the Labriola National American Indian Data Center at ASU. But CDA is focused on outreach to the communities in the form of resource sharing. So they conduct workshops in the community, emphasizing that what's important to these communities to preserve and share is what is important to the university archives. And they scale their model to share their archival skills, showing what is possible for the home communities to do preserving in their own settings. So Nancy talking about, I think, her evolving thought process of reaching out more to the communities for ASU says, for me, it's an ideology that I've kind of developed, the theory that I've developed over the last 9 years in using Gloria Anzaldúa and her path of conocimiento and decolonizing minds, creating community healers who are also community archivists and teach their own communities how to preserve. Next. So just to wrap up, CDA's outreach is not prospective or collection development focused. It's sometimes collaborative, sometimes participatory, depending on the work that they're doing and the desires of the community that they're working with. It's not post-custodial. Items might be donated, and some of the description is given to ASU by the community, but the archive uses LOC, so it is subject to those access standards. Next. And I have 2 quotes coming up from student archivists that participated in the focus group, and I was really attuned to their observations because they're both undergrads and graduate students that come from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. They're not professional archivists or training to be archivists, so I felt like they had really astute observations that were, kind of what we're thinking through in this project. And Caitlin Saunders, in trying to define what the Community-Driven Archives project is talking about that it's a challenge to define because it challenges what it means to be a collecting entity. And they do collect things, but it's through relationships that are not transactional. Next. And Myra Khan was talking about changing the narrative about collecting archives and dominant institutions, and saying we really tried to change the narrative from us being the central repository of all of our collection, of all of the community's collections, to really decentralizing the collection process and encouraging communities to care for their own collections. Next. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Ames. So as we wrap up the presentation, one of the things we're doing is really thinking about how we make sense of the data. And these are just some of the things that have shaped my perspective as, looking at it, thinking about the process, and then what's next for our 3rd year. Thinking about contextual relationality and about the naming that's based on context and the relationships within that context. And then we have community-based archives as always in relation, communities and in relationship to multiple histories. And then thinking that archival naming practices are always political and they always do something. And that our work in community archives are always a story so far. And again, here's the website, storytellinglab.io. And I look forward to questions you may have in the Q&A. And I say thank you very much. And thank you to my collaborators.
Cool, thanks guys. But I'm going to start sharing my screen now as we move into the next part of the presentation. So yeah, in the next part of our discussion, we're going to present 4 different projects that all use different methods of inviting description from donors and creators to describe their own materials. And then we'll have ample time at the end to kind of synthesize and discuss in this Q&A session. But I'm Rachel Zipperer. I'm the University Archivist at the University of North Texas. And I'm going to start off by talking about our web application for donating digital materials. Then Rodrigo Leal from the Texas Archive of the Moving Image is going to talk about their project Archive Dive. Jennifer Hecker is going to talk about zines and her work with the Town Talk Library. And then Alan Garcia is going to wrap things up talking about his neighborhood archiving project, the Austin Barrio Archive. So yeah, like I said, I'm the University Archivist at the University of North Texas. And today I'm going to talk about our web application called Keeper and how we've used it to both invite donors to describe their own materials and incorporate that description into the archival record that we make available. So Keeper, like I said, is a web application that we launched in 2017, which was a little bit before my time at UNT. So I wasn't here to develop this project, but I took over managing it. And the idea behind Keeper is that we wanted to have a simple way to facilitate the donation of digital materials. Because we're a university archive, part of our mission is to not just collect materials that reflect the university's history as an institution, but also like our campus culture and student life. And so much of that is recorded only digitally these days. So we came up with this platform to help document some of that. So this is just a little bit about how Keeper works and what it looks like, I guess. It's a pretty simple interface. Like I said, it's a web application, so it functions in your web browser, kind of just like a web form. This screenshot on the left is what Keeper looks like when you go to upload materials. So like I said, pretty simple. You can either click or drag and drop files from your desktop. It's also mobile friendly, and you can upload any type of file. Most people choose photos, but we have donations of videos and audio and doc files, really whatever you can think of. And then the only information we require from donors is their name, their affiliation with UNT, their email address so we can contact them. And then by checking that checkbox at the bottom, they agree to our donor form. But then we also have this free text box for description where donors can describe their materials themselves, whatever they're uploading. And that's where things get kind of interesting, I think, in inviting this kind of description, because we don't ask for like specific metadata fields or really give a ton of specific guidance about what should go into this text box. Donors interpret this in lots of different ways. Sometimes they might just include a date that a photo was taken. Sometimes they choose not to add any description at all. And sometimes what they write in this description box is, like, in my opinion, as archivally valuable as the materials that they upload, and can be kind of a really like insightful space where they can add in their own words description. But after people donate, what happens to the things that are submitted to Keeper is I add more kind of standard archival metadata like titles, a brief content description, keywords, that kind of thing. And then they're uploaded to the UNT Digital Library and the Portal to Texas History, where these records are available to anyone with an internet connection to explore and browse and search for. But I also, along with that kind of more standard metadata that I apply, always include as a displayed note verbatim the description that the donor included in that text box. So I just have one example that I think is kind of poignant to kind of hopefully illuminate what I mean about the value of this description that our donors add. So this is a screenshot of kind of the basic record from an item that was submitted to Keeper. This photo was submitted as part of an assignment that I helped develop for an undergraduate class at UNT, where they were asked to document kind of their experience of COVID-19 and upload to Keeper items that reflected that experience. So yeah, this is a photo of Derek Kirby, who submitted this photo. He's a student at UNT, holding up his baby to a Zoom meeting with his grandmother, right? We've got our kind of basic archival description there. But then this is the description that Derek included in that text box. So it's pretty long, so I don't expect you to read it all word for word right now while I'm talking. But yeah, I thought Derek was a good example of using this space to really give us a lot more context for the photograph, and also really tell us a lot about how he was thinking and feeling and what his experience was that was not captured in the photograph. So in this description, yeah, he lets us know that he's a student at UNT and how transitioning to all online classes really affected him, as did transitioning to only being able to see his extended family remotely via Zoom and being a new parent and having that experience. He also lets us know that, you know, while we can see from this photo that he's holding up a baby to a Zoom screen, he lets us know in his description that in this particular photo, this was one of the first times his baby could like interact with the person on the other side of the screen. So he kind of tells us about this really special moment they were able to capture. And then in his last little paragraph, he really reflects on what his, like what he was thinking and feeling at the time he uploaded this photo. So this is several months ago. So he kind of ponders about, you know, when there might be a COVID-19 vaccine and he is able to see his family again, and then kind of resigns to saying like weekly Zoom visits we'll have to do until then. So I don't know, I hope that kind of illuminates how, you know, including this description from donors both adds context to the items that they upload, and I think the description itself can function as its own kind of documentary artifact too, right, about kind of what people's experience is in the current moment. So yeah, that's just one example. Like I said, people interpret that text box in lots of different ways. So I invite you to later explore kind of more of the collection and see kind of how other people have contributed. But yeah, with that, that's about all I have to say in my overview. I'm gonna hand it off to Rodrigo. If you're ready, Rodrigo.
Y'all can hear me now, right? I mean, just stop. Somebody send me a DM if I'm just talking to nobody.
We can hear you.
Great. Let's see. So my presentation is a little bit different in form. Like what I'm presenting about is a little different in nature from Rachel's, but I think it's linked by the same goal of trying to make donors the authorities of their own like materials and really centering their story in the description. So I'm gonna fly through this thing because I want to be respectful of my fellow panelists and the QA. A little bit about me. I am currently working for the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services and within the Records Management Group. But previously and very recently, I was at the Texas Archive of the Moving Image. I proposed this when I was still working there, and I'm very happy to still be presenting on it because I'm very proud of the project, and I'm very proud of Tammy's mission. Very briefly on Tammy, it's a 501c3 nonprofit founded in 2002, based in Austin, but with statewide services. We have a partnership with the Texas Film Commission within the Office of the Governor since 2008 to offer free digitization to anyone within the state of Texas, or anybody that has materials related to Texas. So a couple times a year, Tammy goes out into various parts of Texas or asks for mail-in submissions for this program. Before I get into the core of my presentation, I want to preface it by briefly describing the process of digitizing an item at Tammy, and then I'll go through that process again and describe what kind of description we get at each stage. So quickly, Tammy gets first films and videos from a contributor. They're taken to our office where they are prepped, digitized, and then the materials will be returned to the contributor along with a digital copy of the materials. A selection of materials are then uploaded to Tammy's website at texasarchive.org for public viewing. Now, going back through that process, I want to highlight some of the description that we get. So when we first receive films, we'll ask the contributor, what is it about? What's on the case? We'll take a look at what's on the case, what kind of format is it? And then when it's actually being digitized, the technician can watch the film and actually see what's on the film. They can note down, this is a home movie about a Christmas or a birthday party. And then when films are uploaded to the website, there's occasional user contributed like comments, tags. They could point out that they know something about the video. Very obviously, I skipped step 3. And what is going on in step 3? This is the hole in our description workflow that Tammy, we've been trying to come up with ways to address due to the nature of the small size of the institution and how quickly we're going through materials. We haven't really been able to reconnect with donors after they get their materials back. Because very often when donors first drop off their materials, they will, like 9 times out of 10, say, oh, I don't really know what's on these films. I haven't seen them in either years or actual decades, or they were my parents. I think I'm on like a few of these. I don't really know. So we digitize them, and then when they get them back, that could be the first time they're really seeing those materials in a very long time. And recently, I revisited some of my family's home movies. I'm not going to play it just for time. And when you rediscover some of your own material, memories naturally come back. And I have a lot of insight to this very short clip. It's 15 seconds, but it really, I could detail that's my grandpa, that's my cousin, that's my sisters. I know where they are. I know so much. And we have been trying to figure out, how do we get that information from the donors? We've thought of a few things, and we've tried to get a little experimental about it. And last year, we came up with a program called Archive Dive. This was inspired by something like a home movie day. And can we make a space for people to talk about their films, to talk to the creators? And how do we make that as collaborative and audience-driven as something like a home movie day within the time of the pandemic in 2020? So we naturally turned to live streaming. We came up with it last year, and we started this year at the beginning of this year in February. Very quickly, these are the tools we use to set up the stream. If anyone has questions on any specifics, please ask me in Q&A or in the chat. But I'm just going to keep moving along. Archive Dive has been streamed to Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, and potentially more platforms. I'm going to go ahead and play an example of what Archive Dive looks like. This is from our very first session with Richard Eisenhower, the collections coordinator at the Texas State Preservation Board. And in this minute clip, you're going to see Richard talking about one of his family's home movies. It's a nitrate film from, I think, the 30s in Galveston. His mom, his grandfather, great-grandfather are all in this clip. And I think it's just a really good example of how just donor commentary in real time can really add a lot of context to a film and really flesh out what that film is about. And let's see if I can get this in full screen easily. I hope it's a decent volume too.
I can't hear anything, Rodrigo. I don't know if other people can or not.
Thanks, Zines. Well, let's see.
Someone says you might need to share sound on Zoom. I don't know what that
So
means,
I'm
but I
gonna
bet someone else does because it's more competent than me.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing that. What I'm gonna say, because I don't want to waste time trying to figure out how to do that. He's describing that this gentleman here is his great grandfather, Edward Ketchum, who was the sheriff during the Galveston storm, and he's describing how in the middle of the storm he was downtown trying to like evacuate people, and then the gentleman that walks over here on the left is his son, who had to take like a horse and carriage and bring him supplies during the middle of the storm. That this house almost like torn down, and it is very insightful. And if you really want to like hear the full story, you can find the clip pretty easily at our website or on our Facebook group. I'm sorry about the audio, that's a shame, but like I said, I want to keep moving along as well. Now if I can figure out how to close this. Now this is, there we go. Again, apologies about that. So I want to kind of just evaluate what Archive Dive succeeds at and its weakness. And I'll start with the limitations so we can end on a positive note. Archive Dive is inherently pretty time intensive. We're a small staff, and each one of these, even though once a month, takes at least like a full day's work from like multiple people. Prep, the production, finding the host. It's a large process, and it's ultimately has a pretty small scope. We can only talk to a person at a time, and we have thousands and thousands of films that we're not giving this treatment to, or have hundreds of contributors and donors that don't get to partake in this just because we can't do this daily, we can't do this weekly. And then the information we glean from these interviews is difficult to incorporate back into Tammy's proper archive. Like, I think when I left the project, we briefly discussed, do we get transcriptions and putting back in a different field on the video's proper page, or how do we link the video? So there's holes. But I think a program like this has its merits. One, I think it's a really insightful, entertaining program, and it's among like the higher engaged with things that Tammy produces, and it's a good conduit for interacting with donors, getting to know them, and it's also, we learned that it does form a kind of space on the internet for like donors to engage with like their friends and family. That's mostly who's watching this, old friends or old colleagues, and you can see them in the chat, just like, oh, I remember when you filmed this news report, Larry. That was a different interview. And I think it's really exciting getting to position these materials in a way where the donor is obviously the authority, because they are the authority. They have the most insightful things to say about that, and they really bring out the stories to these films. I'm going to wrap up there. There's my contact info if you have any questions related to the tech. How do you put this together? I can talk about other aspects of Archive Dive, but if you want to talk to the current team, please find them at texasarchive.org. Elizabeth Hansen and Catherine were both a big part of this project. And with that, I can pass it off to Jennifer.
Sorry, guys. Lost my controls again. Y'all see my screen? All right, I'm going to assume that you can.
Yes.
All right, so thanks. I want to say thanks to all the presenters who already went and laid the intellectual groundwork for the romp through zine worlds that I'm about to talk about. Let's see. Here we go. Oh boy. All right, so I'm Jennifer Hecker. I'm the reference archivist at the Austin History Center. I've been an archivist and a zine librarian since 2001, but I've also been a zine creator or a zine maker or a zinester. You'll hear all of those since 1994. And that's all I'm going to tell you about myself for the purposes of this presentation. I also do run Town Talk Library on the side, which is a zine library. And I also organize Lone Star Zine Fest and also a zine meetup every month during non-COVID times. So that's how I'm connected to the community right now. So what are zines? If you've never heard of them, I think they're kind of having a moment right now. So I think more and more people have heard of them than usual when I started talking about this topic. But zines are self-published magazines. I think they're really interesting for libraries and archives because they contain really unfiltered voices that are hard to find in commercially published resources. Anybody can make a zine and they can make it about anything. So there's no profit motive involved. There's also really deep communities around zines. They connect people who have really specific interests. They started in the 1920s, arguably. Some people will take it back farther than that, but around like sci-fi fandom and movie fandom. You'll see a zine there on the left that it is from that time. But then the whole DIY aesthetic really got a boost in the 60s and 70s, and we got a lot of political zines and rock and roll punk zines. This is the super short version of this introduction. If you're interested, check out a session later in the week on Thursday called All Things Zines, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. But for the time being, now you know what a zine is. So here's some other examples of zines. They're not all about politics and punk rock. They can be very personal. They can be comics. They can be recipes. They can be whatever you want. They could be all of those things in one zine. So there's a big diverse group of communities out there who have really, really specific interests that can be drawn upon for description purposes. So here's a slide that is old and it's not currently accurate, but you'll get a sense of the number of zine libraries that are all over the United States and North America. And then there are more all over the world. So this is always a growing and changing situation. There's currently several in Austin, which is actually covered up right there. So they're on top of each other, but there's tons of them all over, and there's probably one in your community. In fact, you'll see in the Southwest region, it looks a little spare, but like I said, this is from several years ago. And I believe there are zines in the collections at the Amistad and at Newcomb College in New Orleans. Albuquerque has a zine library and a zine fest. Oklahoma City, Dallas, Fort Worth, like all over this is happening. So you'll probably have a community near you. Here in Austin, we have zines at our public library. They're non-circulating, but you can read them on site. We also have zines throughout our collections at the Austin History Center, both in archival collections and also in our periodicals collection. And then on the right, that's just a picture of Denver Zine Library, which is just kind of representative of one of how a community zine library often looks. You'll see they're storing all their zines by subject on a shelf, which is kind of mind-blowing. And then also that they use, I think, a lot of upcycled cereal boxes to store their collection, which I really love. They can be really, really resourceful and inspirational, I think, to some of us who are maybe overthinking things sometimes. So I'm just gonna run through real quickly three, actually, not to distract you, three real quick ideas from this community about pulling in people to help you with your description. I'm going to talk about homegrown thesauri and cataloging parties and crowdsourced transcription. So the Anchor Archive Zine Library in Halifax has been around since 2006, and they're a community library. They've moved around to a bunch of different places, and they have developed a zine thesaurus, which has evolved over the years. Now there is a clickable interactive version, but they also have a PDF. I've got some screenshots to share. It is a 33-page long PDF of subjects that they use. And it's been really, really useful for the rest of the community. Other libraries have these as well, but Anchor Archive has become really a go-to. And I'm just gonna let you look at these real quickly and see how granular some of their subjects get and how specific they can be to certain communities, like the bicycling community, for example. A lot of our archives would only really need one term for that. But when you get into, you know, a collection that has 20,000 zines about cycling, you might need to break it down a little bit more. Here we go, more cycling. But then we have, you know, detective mysteries over there, totally normal. Experimental poetry and fiction, environmental degradation, all kinds of good stuff. So that's one example of a homegrown thesaurus, and there are many others. The Zine Librarian's website has collected a few, and we'll get to that in a minute. Here's another one, is the Zine Wiki. This is the entry for me in the Zine Wiki. This is a place that people have used for using the URLs as identifiers in their catalogs. It's a wiki, so it's collaboratively based, and the people who tend to add to it know a lot about zines. So it's a really handy resource as well. Zenelibraries.info is the website of the Zine Librarians community, and it's a really robust community. They have lots of wonderful resources about zine cataloging and lots of other things, including early on this list that they made of various different zine libraries and what their subject headings were. And those included lots of different archives and libraries, including Barnard College and Simmons University, Vancouver Public Library, and then a whole bunch of different homegrown zine libraries. So then Queersy Archive Project, which is a really fantastic archive, which hosts residencies where you can stay inside of the archive during the summer for a couple weeks and do research, which is really fun. They have a really robust online presence and really good cataloging practices. So they created kind of one of the earlier subject lists, and then also building towards a thing that the zine community is working on, the Zine Union catalog. A bunch of us got together and started working a little bit more on how to kind of formalize some shared metadata. So Milo from qzap made a zine around describing how to use Zine Core, which is the metadata standard schema that we came up with for describing zines. It's just a select list of Dublin core fields, really. It's not super surprising to anybody who works with this stuff professionally. To people who whose practice involves more DIY stuff, this kind of came as a revelation. And so it's been a really cool group to be involved with, to see both of those groups coming together in a really fruitful way and informing each other. So this is just a screenshot from the zine. I'll post at the end of this a link to my website where all these links are, so you can download and print out the zine for yourself if you'd like. So during one of our conferences, it came to light that the Independent Publishing Resource Center up in Portland, this was a few years ago now, was having 24-hour zine cataloging like parties. And there were people who would come from across the country to help them catalog. It was wonderful. They would have, pizza and cookies and caffeine and dance party breaks and whatnot. And it was really wonderful time. And then this, one of their zine librarians, Lily, who you can see there dressed as Jareth. She pulled together some of her community resources and got together a group who coded a interactive zine cataloging game interface. And when I was at UT Libraries a few years ago, we got to retool it and use it there for an event. And so the gamification really took it to the next level. She said that they had been using like a whiteboard previously and writing down who had cataloged how many zines. But then as they, once they instituted this interface, oh, here's a screenshot from our retooling of it where we replaced the Pacific Northwest Yeti with an armadillo for local use here in Austin. The challenge was to help the armadillo catalog all the zines and get out of the enchanted zine forest. But as you go, you could get, oh, sorry, I'm out of order. Here's the catalog form that they created to where you could enter your information, and it's got a little cheat sheet there for users that says in plain language what that field is supposed to be, right? So you could earn badges in the interface that they created, which was super fun. And I thought, you know, oh, this is like kind of silly, but apparently badges really do motivate people. The story from the first year they implemented this, that was that there was they had a Harry Potter badge that you could get if you cataloged a Harry Potter zine, but there was one group who at a certain point had all the badges except that one, and there were no more Harry Potter zines left to catalog. So they took a break and went outside and made a Harry Potter zine and came back in and cataloged it just so they could get the dang badge. So it does motivate people, it turns out. So that was super fun. And then the last thing, I'm going through this very quickly. I want to get to the Q&A where we can all talk about the similarities of these projects. But the last thing is crowdsourced transcription, and people, you can say collaborative transcription if you like. When we say crowdsource in this particular instance, we don't mean paying people on Mechanical Turk, but more that this interface is just open to the public and anybody can go in. I use From the Page because they're personal friends of mine, but there are a lot of different interfaces like this, and maybe you've seen one by now. There have been a lot of popular projects around this kind of thing. In this case, I was an early adopter of From the Page when it was in beta and helped develop a little bit of it, some of the principles of how it works. And so I've got my personal zines that I wrote when I was really young up there. If you go check them out, enjoy them, don't judge. But one of the fun things is I've gotten people from all over the world helping transcribe them. And obviously that's not particularly description, but you'll see any of the underlined words in this screenshot that are, those are all linked to a subject page, and they each have an opportunity to further describe them. So where it says Susan, I happen to know who the last name of that person because she is a friend of mine because I wrote about her. And so on the back end, I can add her last name and make that a more descriptive entry. Additionally, here's a list of venues that have been tagged that I wrote about. And I found one that was interesting. It says Brentwood Tavern, and I didn't know what that was, which was weird because I wrote this. And then I realized after finding a conversation on Facebook, where I had to find out where it came from. Turns out Punk House Shed is what I called it. It was the house I lived at, and we had shows back there. I did not know. Apparently a lot of other people in the community called it the Brentwood Tavern. It was like literally in my backyard, and I did not know the correct terminology for it. So it's really amazing what you can learn from your community in that way. And I think that's all I've got. Yeah, if you want to go to that link later on, after you hear from Alan Garcia, a bunch of the resources I just talked about are there, and I'm happy to take questions later. So, but next up, we've got Alan Garcia of the ATX Barrio Archive. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm super curious about Taco Land that showed up on one of the venues. I'll have to ask you about that later. That sounds so familiar to me. I'll go ahead and start. Okay, so first off, thank y'all for inviting me to speak today on this panel. Y'all have really made me feel at home, made me feel very welcome. This is the first time I've spoken at a conference, so yeah, thank y'all for making it a very comfortable, welcoming experience. My name is Alan Garcia. I am a lifelong resident of Austin, Texas. I currently work for the George Washington Carver Museum and the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel, which are two East Austin sites operated by the City of Austin's Museums and Cultural Programs Division. And today, I'm going to talk about this community archiving project that I started back in 2016 that is hosted on Instagram. For the moment, it's known as the ATX Barrio Archive. And I'm going to be talking about the way I use social media to interact with other Native Austinites and the different ways that I respect their identities, their neighborhood identities, barrio identities, by letting them participate in the description of photos that they share with me, and also just photos of Austin that I upload and that they contribute comments to, and how I work that into some of the photo captions. And you know, Austin is a city known for many things, right? Around the world, it's known as a music city, a culinary city, this entertainment hotspot. But for me, the Barrio Archive came about, as you can see on the slide, as a way to pay tribute to the people that really get left out of those conversations, the places that never get mentioned in stories about Austin's growth and Austin's past. And that includes people like my parents, who are pictured here, people who worked in the back of the house and Austin's restaurant and hotel industry, people who helped build the city, you know, working class folks, immigrants, communities of color that don't get mentioned a lot, and to put it bluntly, you know, get erased from a lot of the conversations. So the main mission behind the page is just to have a digital space for longtime Austinites to share memories. At the same time, I'm doing archival research in public archives and academic archives, and sharing that on the page for folks who may not have access to that because they're not enrolled in a particular university. What I have come across too is that people aren't aware that those spaces exist and that they are available to them as members of the public. So what happens a lot of times is that I'll share an item, for example, the photo that's on this slide, that comes from a public archive, and family members reach out to me very excited because they've never seen this content before. And in the case of the Marshall family, this is a photo of an advertisement. It's an advertisement for their trucking company that they operated in East Austin along East MLK Boulevard. And shortly after sharing that on the Barrio Archive, I got a message from a Marshall family member who is still operating the business, and who had said he'd never seen this advertisement and was just really proud to see it, was thanking me, was really excited to see someone sharing his family story on social media. And this is my favorite part of the work, really. And the fact that this happens a lot of times when I'm sharing items that come from public archives is just, I mean, it's mixed feelings. It makes me happy. It really warms my heart to have these interactions with folks, to reconnect them with pieces of their family history. But it does worry me that this whole time they've been removed from these materials that they created, that have been kept in good shape, you know, in these institutions. But there's just still a gap. There's this really wide gap that I'm hoping to fill and just continue doing via social media. So that's something that I really strive to do, is just treat folks with respect, treat their stories with respect. What happens too is that in the archival research, you won't find a lot of documentation on these marginalized neighborhoods, but you will find government publications and other sources that conducted surveys in these areas, but really were out of touch with the communities that live there. In this case, in the historic Rosewood neighborhood of Austin, in the issue of Urban Renewal, we have some really rare glimpses of Rosewood Avenue and a section of the neighborhood that has completely changed today after the urban renewal programs. And just contrasting it with the language that they use to describe these small businesses as typical rundown places, right? And what I've included on the left here are quotes from people who've interacted with me on IG with posts related to small businesses, Mexican restaurants, dive bars, barbecue joints, just a number of spaces that no longer exist. Either they've been pushed out because of property taxes, or the owners have just passed away and the business no longer continues. But as you can see, people still have strong emotional connections to these sites, even though they're no longer standing. And I just wanted to highlight that people bring up smells, family memories, it's still something that they cherish, these memories of back in the day in Austin. So I always love highlighting just people's memories, and I encourage comments all the time. And with an issue of Austin's barrio history and culture that comes up a lot, that people really react to and respond to, is the topic of public housing. I have shared this before, the photo on the left of it came from a report published by the city's housing authority in the late 30s about the construction of Austin's first public housing communities, and the first in the nation, really. The SAADA project, which was built for Mexican-American tenants. And what I've noticed when dealing with the official sources is that the tenants are really talked over, they're not given, they're not named, they're really portrayed as just nameless, faceless individuals, as you can see in the graphic from that same publication. And that's really bothered me. I've shared this because I know people will connect to it, and sure enough, immediately community members share. Oh no. Here we go. Immediately, a community member shared this fascinating family photo of their great-grandparents, who were some of the early tenants of Santa Rita from the same year that photo was taken. But in this case, I'm just respecting their language. I'm incorporating what they send to me in the photo caption that I eventually share. Sometimes people send me really long paragraphs, really passionate family stories that I just capture it all in a quote, just word for word include on there. So that's just a big topic that comes up in this research with barrio history in Austin, as people's family connections, and it's just great to have these connections with longtime residents, and how we can put a name to a face, right, for some of these residents. Another topic that comes up too in the research that there's a lot of misinformation about online, and this was a case where I got it wrong, where I had shared a post from the Austin Chronicle, where this originally appeared, a story about neighborhood gangs and this movement to stop the violence and to come together over softball games, and to just, prove to people that the gangs could stop fighting and really come together for peace. And in this case, I had incorrectly captioned this photo as a photo depicting all the gangs together after the softball game, just celebrating, their peace efforts. And thankfully, with the help of Mondo Martinez, whose comment is on the right here, who reached out to me and corrected me because what wasn't included in the chronicle and what just because this was a little bit before my time in Austin, what something I wouldn't have noticed otherwise was that this is a photo of one gang in particular, the Brothers gang, who were representing 4th Street. So if you can see their hands, you see that they're mostly holding up 4 fingers to represent their specific neighborhood. And I got it wrong. You know, unfortunately, that was just something that I missed, but something that the press missed back then that I was just sharing, you know, in the present day. And it just brought up an important story that only someone who lived through it, like Mondo, who was a former gang member and a native of East Austin, would be able to describe to me, which is that, you know, this was small progress, right? As he says, you'll never find a photo with all 3 gangs together because we just hadn't progressed at that point. You know, they were willing to come together to play ball, but they really weren't willing to come together and shake hands in a form of truce. So me sharing the photo with the original caption which is pretty vague, as you can see, you know, softball diplomacy, cops and kids, bats, balls, really left out a lot. And Mondo, who graciously shared this photo with me after commenting on the original post, a photo from his family collection of the gang that he was involved in, the EGV gang, which stands for East Gran Barrio, and was just telling me another side of the story, right? That that they came together, but things were still a little tense at that moment. And it's just so important to respect his perspective because, you know, let's be honest, this is something that you'll really have a hard time learning about in the archives if you show up in Austin wanting to research the history of breakdancing, the history of graffiti, of gang culture. That's just something that hasn't been properly documented. And those stories are still out there. They're just in the community still, you know, waiting to be recorded via oral histories. But it's fascinating, you know. My last slide is a work of a graffiti mural that was done by Mondo Martinez, who I should mention, today is his birthday. He turned 50, so shout out to Mondo, happy birthday. I doubt he's listening right now, but he's just such an important connection to the community that I want to respect because he can share so many stories about what came afterwards, right? When the truce was finally agreed upon. And what he picked up was art. You know, this was a mural that he started putting up around town with the help of elementary school students. Him and his friends started working with youth groups. And you can still find a lot of these, you know, almost 30-year-old pieces of public artwork in East Austin that came from gang culture, but evolved into these really positive messages, in this case, of just representing your neighborhood, your barrio. There are other examples of murals that are very open about stopping the violence and protecting children because they are the future. And without his help, I mean, that's just a connection that I would not have been able to make using the original source material and just relying on the little materials that exist in the archive. So just a brief sample of the stories that come up in my research. And yeah, thank you all for inviting me, and I'll give the space to my fellow panelists.
Well, thank you, everyone. Please join me in giving a nice virtual round of applause to all the presenters. That was a great program. If y'all don't know how to do that, you have a little reaction button at the bottom. If you're not used to Zoom yet, after a year and a half of doing this, you can clap using the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. And just a quick reminder, if you have questions for the panelists, please post them in the chat at the bottom. I think we can go until 2:30, and I guess if people want to keep it a little bit longer, that's up to the presenters if they want to stay on and answer questions. And I'll go ahead and toss out the first one that came in. Hold on a second, let me bring that up. We had a question that came in early on from Donna, and Donna wrote, I often think that university or other resource institutions with power are not truly compatible, thinking of universities having community-driven parts of their collections. I am concerned for the potentially paternalistic, neoliberal, top-down interruptions to the community. Can you say anything about this, more about what you have learned about this institutional/community dynamic? And I think that was in relation to the first presentation. So we'll let Jamie and her group really respond first.
All right. Well, thank you for that question, Donna. And that's one of the things that we, as researchers, Bianca and Ames and I have really talked about, like, what does it mean to do this work and remain critical and thinking about tossing any rose-colored glasses aside to really think about how power circulates. And what we learned in the focus groups and interviews with the Community-Driven Archives Initiative is the history of how some folks in the libraries, archivists, and also student activists, how they leveraged the power of the institution in the 70s to ensure a distinct visibility and a say in working with the communities. But just recently, ASU has financially supported the CDA project. And so I think for them, it'll be very important to watch for any changes within institutional power and authority. And so that's one of the key things is, you know, from our own work, and maybe Bianca and Ames want to also add to it, kind of listening to the stories of Christine Marin, Marshall Shore, Nancy Godoy, that they're really working on thinking about doing something in the community that's also training, but not necessarily grabbing collections in that way. So that's something I think they have to be careful about moving forward. And Bianca and Ames, do you want to add anything?
I responded a little bit to Donna in the message, but yeah, I appreciate that question a lot, and I think it needs to be asked like anytime this kind of work is happening. And I think Dr. Lee already responded really well, but I'll just say, like, in my experience, that's been a big issue with like the Inside Books Project Archive. It was like began as part of, or it was enabled through like institutional resources, like an Omeka account, but then just recently over the last year, the individuals like in the space who like helped with that were no longer there, and the university like wanted the like server space back, so they like pulled the Omeka. So now I've had to like try and migrate everything. And so in these interviews, I think there's a lot of similar, like it's good when there's individuals, you know, in the space as like accomplices, but when those individuals are gone, the institutions like are just, you know, at root hegemonic, like settler, white supremacist, capitalist, all the things. But I have to cut myself off because I'm going to go into my soapbox. Thank you for asking that question. Steal things from the institutions. Okay, who said that?
Yeah, I'll just add to that, because I come to this from the museums profession, that I also had a healthy dose of skepticism. So far what I've noticed is at least a pure intention of wanting to resource share. You know, how these relationships play out, I've yet to learn in my experiences in this project and becoming a archival professional of some capacity, but I understand the concern, I understand the question.
I want to jump in and say too, I mean, the struggle is real all across types of collections. When I was at UT Libraries, we had written an NEH grant. A large group of us across the zine librarianship community had written an NEH grant to fund the development of the Zine Union catalog, and submitted it. And after it was submitted, UT Libraries pulled it from consideration in favor of a different proposal that somebody else had put in without coordinating it ahead of time, just pulled it. So that was really detrimental. It was a lot of work that had gone into, you know what an NEH grant is like if you've made one. It was a lot of work by a lot of people in the community, and they don't care for UT Libraries much anymore in that community. The good news is Barnard is reviving that grant this year. So hopefully we are going to have that, and all that work is going to be, you know, leveraged, but, you know, just not putting all your eggs in one basket, I think is a really good, you know, move.
Thank you. Thank you for that great question, Donna. We had a question from Mary Saffel. This is for Rachel. Is Keeper an open source software application? And follow up, did you have any obstacles to using it with UNT IT?
So Keeper was actually developed by UNT IT. So it's on GitHub though, so it is open source. And I was prepared that someone's going to ask this, so I'll put the GitHub link in the chat for you if you want to look at it.
Thank you. And speaking of posted things in the chat, there was a request earlier if Rodrigo could post the link to the video that you tried to play, that we could get the audio to work, and the folks maybe can follow up after this presentation to watch that. We had 3 separate but related questions, all for Alan, and so I'm gonna, if folks don't mind, if I can I'm gonna ask them all to let Alan answer once, because I think they're all gonna kind of relate. So we have from Amy Rushing. She asked, Alan, is there a way to preserve your Instagram, a backup or something? Not sure how that works. And then related, Jamie Hastings asked, I have the same question for Alan about how he saves the information or gets permission from folks to save it. And then Marianne posted, does the use of Instagram limit from whom you obtain information? I'm thinking age-wise. So.
Yeah, so I was just in the process of writing a response to Amy and Jamie about the backup. Currently, what Instagram provides is not great. I'm not happy with how social media preserves materials. You know, I just don't think it's a good solution as a sustainable way. So I have been in talks with Dr. Maria Cotera, who is moving back to Austin to UT's Mexican American Studies, Latinx Studies department. She runs a digital archive called Chicano por mi raza, which is similar in mission to the Barrio Archive, but she has been inviting me to start storing items in her server, her reliable cloud storage. And we're talking about ways of even incorporating the comments and just how to preserve everyone's interactions on the Barrio Archive as something that could be searchable with the items metadata. So I'm really looking forward to how that can look for future researchers and just future projects. And Instagram hasn't really presented many limits to me as far as, age-wise with folks who reach out. It's a pretty young crowd, that interacts with me. So I haven't had that issue. I have had people tell me that like Black Panther related posts, when they share it from the Barrio Archive, they get flagged. So that's something that's very troubling, is, content from the radical movement of the 60s is still considered dangerous to some social media censors. So that's the biggest thing I've noticed lately.
And if you want to stay unmuted, Alan, because we've got 2 more questions related to you that I'm going to squeeze in. So from Emily McDaniel asked, do you archive more recent images as well as ones from decades past? Asking about the viral image about the Texas freeze that highlighted that divide, the I-35 divide with no power on the east side and all the downtown skyscrapers still lit up in downtown.
For the recent images tend to be community meetups that I'm invited to. If you've been following local news lately, there's been a big explosion in interest in just the lowrider scene, the Sunday afternoon park scene in East Austin. And I just love to go out there and to document that because it's in the moment, right? Just to encourage people to come out. I'm always willing to share people's, medical benefits. Any given weekend, you'll see people selling barbecue plates in East Austin to raise money for folks who are in need. So that's something that I'm open to sharing. As there's a question about murals, and yes, it's great. Mondo Martinez and some of the original artists from the 90s who painted some of those works in East Austin are still involved. They have a nonprofit group, Arte Texas, that has gotten some city funding to restore some of the original murals. And they've been painting some beautiful ones. Just last year, some really great memorials for folks who have died, who have been killed at the hands of Austin Police Department, and some other longtime neighborhood activists that have passed away from illnesses. So we're always in contact. My dream project is to just compile all the archived images of murals into maybe a zine. We'll see about that, or just something that can be permanent and exist offline for folks who aren't connected to social media. So yeah, they're still friends, and they're doing great work in the community.
Thank you. And if I could take a moment to ask a question I had, and I think it's kind of related to Donna's first question, as well as the questions to Alan about the backing up his Instagram. So, Donna brought up some great points about some of the issues with connecting community archives with institutions. But one thing an institution can bring is this sustainability. A lot of community-based organizations come and go; they disappear quickly, because of lack of resource, lack of initiative, lack of whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess a question I have isn't so much that saying the institutions have to step in to save them, but how can we, as working archivists, how can we as archivists who are maybe tied to larger institutions, what are some things we can be thinking about, or things that we can be doing to help ensure the sustainability of some of these community-based archives while keeping them in the community as best we can? And there may not be an answer, but that's something that always tickles the back of my mind when I think of these projects is, how do we make sure they're gonna be around? I mean, I think of your project, Alan, which is a wonderful project, but you're one guy on Instagram. What happens if Instagram disappears? What happens if, all of a sudden you have something come up in your life and you have to stop doing it and you move? How do we, what are things that we could be doing as we're archivists to make sure these things live on in this new community-based model, not move them to an institution, necessarily? So
yeah,
big loaded question that may not have an answer.
Funding is a big issue. I don't have an estimate for how much I've, spent out of pocket just to properly store things, that I have physical materials, and even just buy, backup storage, hard drives for some of the content. But I think that would be a great start. I mean, I've visited other cities, public libraries that have digitization labs for folks to come and preserve their family materials. I would love to see that at an institution, that we both keep digital copies of the materials for backup, but that something a little more welcoming, that me as something who can bridge the gap with folks in the community who aren't used to, visiting campus or visiting West Austin, and just working together that way. The pandemic obviously is a huge obstacle. And I mean, I work for the city, so I know how things can get, right, budget-wise, but that would be my dream, to just, because we are still divided in Austin, right? For folks who aren't aware, there's still a big divide. We have a lot of wonderful institutions on one side of town, and on the other side of town, they just still haven't been built, but the community is still involved in preserving their history. So yeah, I would just love to see a way that we can come together, you know, help for independent folks like me, and then just help for people in the community who have stuff that hasn't been digitized yet. So that's the dream.
And I posted a couple of things in 2018. Burgess Jules and the Shift Collective put together something called Architecting Sustainable Futures. It's a Mellon project. And so there's a white paper there that I'd recommend. So it's really great to have and be part of conversations with community archivists from all over the United States coming in to kind of talk about, like, what does sustainability even mean? Like, what does it look like for individual archives and community archives? Because often it may not be the same as what institutional archives might require. So too, thinking about what does it mean to be in conversation and returning to the ideas of resource sharing. And out of this particular project, there's another Mellon-funded sort of group with Burgess Jules, Gabe Solis at Texas After Violence, and I think a couple of other folks bringing community archives together to really think through what does it mean to build a network to share resources, because we can exist in small, crappy little buildings. We can have, you know, bad internet, but what happens when we can share that across, you know, different organizations, community groups and collectives, and then, you know, really kind of unplug from the amount of power and control that I think institutions like embody and want from us too. So some reading there for folks. That's really interesting.
I have time to like briefly add on to that.
Please.
And I'm saying this as a critique of this dynamic and as a beneficiary of it. I think too, like sometimes even those spaces are like there's a lot of gatekeeping there too. Like with the Mellon stuff, I think they've revised it since then, but the first round I tried to apply to the community archives grant, and you needed like a $50,000 annual budget to even like fucking apply. And I'm like, community archive has 50 grand a year, like, excuse me. And so I do think they've changed it, but it just shows that, like, again, you have these people who are navigating and embedded in these spaces, not embedded, but the power dynamics are embedded in the spaces, even if rad folks are navigating in them. And it still becomes, you know, like Alan was saying, like more radical, like politics are still very much excluded. And there's a lot of cherry picking about like what communities and individuals are not represented as like a fundamental threat to like institutional power. And I've personally just been really frustrated and disappointed with even community archive spaces that do that. And like some of the stuff, even from the Sustainable Futures, is like, you know, invitation only kind of stuff. And I just think a lot of times it's like nonprofits and 501c3s and people who are, you know, established like academics or white or, you know, whatever, are the ones that get privileged like in those spaces and get to kind of leverage the community-based like identity. And again, I think that binary like really needs to get troubled too, because it's easy to claim, you know, like community-based and without really interrogating like what that means and like the implications of like how resources are still very much like unevenly distributed based on like power and privilege within those spaces. And again, I say that as a like beneficiary of those systems myself. And so it's really hard figuring out like how can we leverage the power to redistribute and constantly critique like our own position in it, and like what is the end term like there. So yeah, that's what I'm
Well, we are 10 minutes over time, but I'm glad we actually took this time because I think Ames' comments was probably a great way to end this, because I think that gives us some definite heavy food for thought to take from this as we, as a potential action piece from this. From we all go to these conferences, we hear presentations, then we intend to go back to work and we don't do anything. So thinking about some of the topics I think we raised at the end, this is a good way to close out this session. So once again, please join me in a virtual round of applause for these great presentations and great speakers. This was a fantastic program. I know I'm going to take a lot away from it myself. Upcoming on the schedule, we have starting 10 minutes ago at 2:30, break with vendors. And so please take a moment to go step in. They graciously gave their time and money to SSA to be able to do this. And so it behooves us to support them a little bit. So I hope to see y'all over there and enjoy the conference. Y'all have a great afternoon.